Hi, welcome to session one of the third topic of the semester, Religious Utopias in the British Colonization of North America. So this is the title, Religious Utopias in the British Colonization of North America. And so we're opening up this topic. This is session one, and we're going to now look at British colonization, particularly British colonization of North America, but instead of looking at economic factors or through an economic analysis, like we did in the second topic, in the European discovery, conquest, and colonization, it was more like an economic interpretation of history dealing with colonization. Again, mercantilism as one of the main, driving forces, if you will, in the discovery of America itself, the conquest, and even the colonization. So we looked at that very closely. But in this third topic, what we're going to do is also looking at the formation of some colonies by England in North America, in which religion, more than economics, even though economics is still playing a key role, as to why people are coming. This is, again, not doing away with economic drives, economic needs. People have economic needs, of course, but now the main driving force that is going to be pushing people out of Europe, particularly from England, and to come to North America to settle and establish their colonies, was religion. So this is yet another factor in the formation of British colonies, the 13 colonies, again, that the British established in North America, that will later become the original 13 states of the United States. What we're going to look at here in this discussion is that not only was economics involved, again, in the settlement and the founding of those colonies, but also religion. Religion was also a critical factor, again, in how the United States started out back in the colonial period when the English settlers were arriving. What was in their minds was that they wanted to establish a series of communities, religious communities that they believed were to become the ideal societies. That's why we call this, again, utopia. Now let me share, of course, the outlines again, in which you see here this is the title, Religious Utopias in the British Colonization of North America. Again, this is the title of this third topic that we're going to also examine in about 3 sessions. And as I said, what the settlers was the English settlers, some of them, again, that actually ended up establishing 5 or 6 of those original 13 colonies. What they had in mind was to come to North America to establish the ideal society. That's what a utopia is. It's the ideal world, the ideal society, that they believed that human societies needed to be organized in a specific way, in that those societies needed to live by religious principles, because ultimately the way that human beings live on earth is going to determine where they're going in the afterlife, after death, that is to say. So they believe that human societies on earth needed to be as closely as possible to the laws of God, to be ruled by religious principles, by divine commandments, and that if people live by those religious principles or divine commandments, that at the end of their lives they were going to save their soul, and then in the afterlife be transferred to a better world, of course, heaven. So it was important, therefore, to form such type of society, which in this time it was referred by many names, but one of the names was the city of God. God's kingdom on earth. In other words, people often refer to those ideal societies in which people were simply following divine principles and religious laws and commandments, helping each other behave in the proper manner and helping each other practice their religion, reinforcing their faith and so on, because ultimately in that way, in the end, they were going to attain salvation, the salvation of the soul in the afterlife. So again, this is going to be a very important factor that led to the establishment of 5 or 6 colonies, in which the founders of those colonies, the original settlers, came precisely to North America with that idea. They were very clear as to what they really wanted to create, and they said, this is an opportunity presented to us by God. They were deeply religious, by the way. So we're going to examine, of course, the factors in this case, the background, the historical background as to what pushed them out of Europe to come to North America at that time in the early 1600s, by the way, or throughout the 1600s, by the way. They're going to continue coming to North America. So it is important to look at Europe, the situation in Europe, as to what was really going on in Europe that pushed people out of Europe to come to North America with that idea. So it's important. It's important because otherwise we're not going to understand their motivations, the reasons why they were coming in such great numbers and so on, and why they saw the Americas, the American continent, the newly discovered continent, as a world in which they were going to actually establish the ideal kingdom, or the cities of God, as they called them. So the discovery of America, of course, was a very important event for Europe, because this provided not only land for commercial opportunities, to start enterprises, to own land, etc., to have an economic future, but also the land in this new continent provided the ideal opportunity to actually start a new society, okay, to build ideal communities, in other words, because back in Europe at this time, as we'll see in this topic, people were already giving up again in Europe as to whether they could actually reform European society and actually establish ideal communities in Europe. So they were just giving up on Europe as a whole, and they believed that Europe was just beyond reform. They wanted to reform European society, to turn it more Christian, if you will. But many of those groups that came to North America had given up on that idea, and they saw in America a new world, land that was so far removed from Europe, in which they could actually start from scratch, like reset, in other words, humanity, start from scratch and build up humanity from the ground up in the way that God intended to be, in the way that God intended humans to live on earth, that is to say. Okay, so again, this is what we're going to actually examine in this topic. And again, it's going to be more like a religious history. Okay, so we're shifting gears here, and that we're going to examine religion, the significance, for example, of religion in human societies. And of course, we're going to examine a series of different religious belief systems. So it's important that you understand that this presentation, of course, deals with a multiplicity of different views, religious views. So it's important to examine all of them, what each group believed, etc. So this is not, again, a presentation in which we're just going to prefer one view over another, or choose one view to be the correct one and the others are not, but rather, again, just a very objective analysis again of all of the ideas again that circulated in Europe, that were important to people, the religious beliefs, the religious rituals that were important to people, in how they inspire people to build communities, to build a society. In other words, religion is very important in that regard. So this is why we have to start then our presentation, this topic, by looking very briefly at the functions of religion in human society. So again, before we delved immediately into history and look at European history and religions, of course, it's important to first look at some of the theoretical implications that scholars have come to present, of course, regarding religion, the function of religion. Again, what is the function that religion plays in human society? It has to serve a function, in other words, in society. So again, this is just a very quick just overview, so we understand that once we start looking at historical events, it's going to become very clear, why there are certain movements, religious movements, for example, in Europe and so on, and how rulers are also involved in those movements, etc. It will become very clear. Okay, so religion, to understand the functions of religion in human society, I have outlined at least 5 major functions, although there are more, but the most important ones that concerns our presentation are 5. For example, religion is very important for human beings because it provides meaning to their existence. So there are certain mysteries, if you will, that affect us very much, that concerns us very much as we experience life on Earth as human beings. And that is, for example, what is life itself? Why are we alive? I mean, you might say, okay, so those are philosophical questions, and they are, but nonetheless, every human being is confronted with that. Why am I alive? What is life? Why do we die? Okay, why is there death? We witness death, in everything that lives. Everything that lives at some point must die, whether it's a plant, an animal, human being, etc. So again, those are very deep, profound questions. And the other, of course, is what happens to me when I die. So when I die, is there life after death? Okay, are we continue existing, in other words, in some form or another? I mean, is there existence after death, in other words? And if there is existence, then where do we go? Okay, where exactly do we go? And do we come back at some point, back to Earth, and live again or not? Again, so this is, again, a series of things that humans are very concerned by. And of course, religion provides ideas, provides beliefs, again, in which people can find some form of comfort in this world and cope with life and the predicaments of life. Once again, why are we alive, and why do we die, what happens after death, etc., all of that. So it provides meaning for human existence, in other words, one of the functions. The other function is, again, that religion also throughout history has served the function of providing human beings with explanations as to why and how things work in nature. Why does it rain? What causes rain, for example? Why there's earthquakes, or what is a lightning, for example? Natural phenomena. In other words, we live in the world of nature. We are confronted with the forces of nature, and we're trying to understand those forces as to what are those forces and how do they work. Why there's an earthquake, why there's droughts and eclipses and so on and so forth. Of course, all of that today we just use, modern societies use science to answer that, of course, but this is just very recent. The use of science has been around for 200-300 years, again, thereabouts. Modern science, that is trying to answer those questions scientifically in a very materialistic manner. But for thousands and thousands of years, human beings use religion, again, to try to understand the cosmos, trying to understand the universe, in other words, trying to know how it works, and why it works the way it does, etc., and so on and so forth. So again, this is another function. Again, people use religion for thousands of years as a form of science, if you will, as a scientific system. Number 3 is that there's another function, and it's a more political function, in that religion also plays a political function in that it really serves to provide legitimacy to rulers and ruling institutions. So it's not just a philosophical, system that provides comfort for people to cope with, the predicaments of life and death, or a scientific system in which people are trying to know the universe, how it works, but it's also, has a political function in that throughout history, religion also has served to legitimize rulers, kings or chiefs across the planet. In almost every culture for thousands of years claimed that their right to rule was given to them by God or a series of gods, or was given to them by ancestors who were divine beings in the past, and so they inherited that right through a lineage, a family, if you will, of rulers who continue this mandate, that they were given the mandate to rule, again, by divine beings. Again, there's many versions of that, but religion serves to legitimize the validity of the rulers, the authority of the rulers, that why there's a ruler, why there's a monarch ruling over the kingdom or ruling over society, is because this is divinely ordained, in other words. So the priests, the religious figures that were leading the religion will often create public ceremonies to bless the ruler and so on and so forth, reminding people where the ruler's power was coming from, and that was really coming from God, in other words. So again, this was virtually really the norm all over the planet until recently. There's still today a handful of rulers who derive their right to rule from divine sources, but they're very few. We live in the modern age, and again, this is kind of phasing out, if you will. More and more, we're moving into more like an era in which rulers claim the right to rule because people, of course, granted that right to them through some form of process. The consent of the governed is called, right? Okay, so again, but for thousands of years, okay, the norm is religion provided legitimacy to rulers, of course. All right, so the last four are going to the last two. I'm sorry, number 4 and number 5 are going to be very important for understanding, of course, our topic. Even though the third one also is very useful for understanding some of the issues we're going to be looking at as we examine Europe, of course. But point number 4 and point number 5 are going to be extremely critical for understanding the some of the movements again that we're going to be looking at in Europe, particularly like the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and also other movements that we're going to be looking at later on in the semester as well, like the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, much later in the semester. But again, this is pretty much establishing the foundation of that, and that is that religion also has been used. The function of religion is that religion also has been used as a source of inspiration for fueling reform movements. There's from time to time, there are movements in which people actually create organizations or groups that want to change society, that they want to reform it, in other words. And more often than not, many of the movements of the past, including some of the movements of today, by the way, look at religion, as a source for a source of inspiration. In other words, they use things like prophecy. They use things like the coming of a better world that was announced in the past. They use religious principles. In other words, something that was established in the past, like commandments. We have forgotten those teachings and we need to rescue them, bring them back. And we need to reform society in a way that we're going to be guided or living by those principles. And in many cases, religion inspired those reform movements. People want to reform society and kind of restore something that was lost from the religion's teachings, the religious ideas or commandments and laws that people simply forgot, or abandoned, and they want to bring them back. The reformers want to bring them back, but they want to bring them back in order to reform society because they see society too lost, too confused, or perhaps too decadent, that it was just decaying, in other words. So this is very important. I mean, this is something we're going to be looking at, of course, in this topic and very closely, and it's going to be one of the foundational theories for understanding many of the reform movements we're going to be looking at again, not only in this topic but in future topics as well. Also, number 5 is that religion also serves the purpose of strengthening social bonds and to bring people together. In other words, it really brings people together so people can strengthen their links, their relationships, and of course come together to solidify, if you will, the society. In other words, that what we're talking about in point 5 is that religion also serves to create groups or to create communities and to maintain them over time. And this often happens through ritual. Because every time there's a ritual, there's a public ceremony, people attend the ceremony, or when people attend church, for example, to listen to a service or mass, etc., the members of the society that go there are actually united in those spaces as members of the same religion. They are united under a common identity, a religious identity. We're all members of the same church. We believe the same ideas. We share the same values, the same beliefs. So there is a kind of fraternity, if you will, that is formed within religious organizations in which people see themselves as brothers and sisters at some level, of course. And that creates, of course, the sense of community. It brings them together. And, of course, every time, what we're going to be looking at here, that, again, people wanted to build a community. like a colony in North America. Religion serves as a glue again to bring the members of that religion in order to actually build the society, the colony, if you will, because they were all, members of the same faith. Okay, a community of the faithful, if you will. Okay, in which they all have the same faith, the same beliefs, they practice the same religion, and they, of course, came together, solidified their relationships, and created a colony, if you will, a religious colony. So this is very important that we're going to be looking at here in North America is the creation of utopias. That's the people that came over in the 1600s from England, that they came with a certain religious belief system. Okay, they were members of the same religion, they had the same ideas, the same beliefs, and they came with the idea to North America that they were given the opportunity to establish again the ideal society in the eyes of God, and so they were now working together, in building that kind of society. The religion serves to bring people together for a common purpose, and the purpose is we need to build a colony. Okay, because by building this colony, we're going to create the city of God. Okay, it's going to be the city of God. It's going to be God's kingdom on earth, etc. And this is the way people should live, in other words. So, at any rate, so we are going to then now proceed to look at the European religious background. We have to understand what was really going on in Europe during this time, in which that shaped, if you will, the psyche, the mentality of the Europeans, to shape the culture, to shape the society in a way that by the 15 and 1600s, you'll be able to understand what happened in Europe. Again, the specific moments of European history that slowly but surely created the conditions for the massive outpouring of European religious groups, many of which are coming from England, to come to North America. Okay. All right, so let's start then with the European religious background. Okay, so let's start with understanding the background in Europe, the religious background, and to the formation of those British colonies. And in order to understand that, we need to go back in time in European history to the founding of Christianity itself. And the reason for that is because the settlers, the English colonists that are coming to establish those ideal societies I just mentioned, were, without exception, were all Christian. Okay, they identify themselves as Christian, but in this case, they identify themselves as to practice the kind of Christianity that Christ actually established back in, again, when God, they believed, of course, in this case, 1500 years from their perspective. We're talking about 1500 years, in the past. Again, they believed that, again, that Christ was on earth, of course, and established a specific set of teachings, if you will, that serve to help people actually attain salvation. Okay, so we're now looking again at a group of people coming in the 1600s to North America who identify themselves as original Christians, meaning that they were practicing or believing the teachings of Christ as Christ taught, again, those principles back 1500 years ago, 1600 years ago, from their perspective. And so we're talking about what they said, of course, what they claim to be, of course, original Christianity. Their argument, as we'll see, is that the Christianity practiced in Europe during this time, for the most part, had departed from those original teachings. Okay, so again, this is, something that we have to assess and analyze, etc. So therefore, it is important to go back in time to understand the founding of Christianity, in order to understand the English settlers, again, of the 1600s in North America, and their Christian principles or their Christian ideas that they brought. All right, so one of the very important, of course, moments in the founding of Christianity, one of the most important factors, if you will, is that Christianity itself, besides being a religious system, if you will, a system of teachings, if you will, that Christ instituted, is the fact that Christianity itself was also a social reform movement as well, besides being a religion. The reason for that is because during this time that we're talking about, the moment, again, when Christ, of course, lived, back during the time of the Romans, again, and in fact, you are acquainted with the history of Christianity and Roman history. It's very evident that from the records that we know, is that the Romans, in this case, were the ones that actually crucified Christ. Okay. So again, this is something that even comes from the doctrine, if you will. Okay. So after the crucifixion, etc., what we're going to look at is that people that follow Christ, many of whom were disciples and others, of course, are going to take the teachings, if you will, into different regions. Some of those regions are going to be Europe, Rome, at the very heart of the Roman Empire itself. We're going to see now the influx again of people who claim, of course, to be followers of Christ, to be moving into Rome. And their idea, it was to reform Roman society at that point in time, because Roman society had become very decadent, okay, to say the least, again. Something that we know from Roman historians, for example, people that were living at those times, for example, or people that wrote, about the Romans after them, is that when the Romans were now building the empire, if you will, okay, Roman society became very, very centered on pleasures, for example, on violence. There were spectacles in which gladiators were fighting each other, and there were, of course, very gory sports events, and people were slaying each other, and so on and so forth. And people cheered, and people actually celebrated that. So there was alcoholism, and so on and so forth. Again, so it was very, very decadent. So the purpose of the Christians, therefore, was to go into Rome and trying to spread the teachings, if you will, of Christ, and trying to reform Roman society in the process. So once again, the use of religion, of course, is very important in reform movements. Again, this is just one example of how we're going to see this pattern repeated in history. Ever since, again, the rise of Christianity, Christianity itself was a social reform movement because the Christians wanted to transform Roman society. So they could abandon the violence, they could abandon the alcohol, and so on and so forth. That was so pervasive during this time. So from the year 60, this is more or less the moment in which we're going to see the coming of the Christians to Rome, all the way to the year 325. And this process unfolded in that we're seeing, of course, that Christianity, it was attempting to reform Roman society, and although they faced outright persecution from the Roman authorities, because the Christians did not acknowledge, they did not recognize the authority of the Roman emperor. They questioned the authority of the Roman emperor because the Roman emperor claimed to be a divine figure, like a descendant of the Roman gods, in other words. Well, the Christians didn't believe in the Roman gods. So what we're going to see is that Christians were not very welcome by the Roman rulers, and they were often facing persecution because they were considered to be, of course, elements that were trying to cause problems or disruptions in the political order and so on. So despite the persecution, however, what we're going to see is that that the Christians, of course, are going to grow in numbers. So from being a minority, okay, just a handful of individuals spreading the teachings, if you will, there were no central churches, there were no institutions that would be called Christians, and still, the religion of the state back in Rome was the Roman religion, and people worshiped the Roman gods in this case. But from being just a grassroots movement, if you will, in which people were trying to convert others and so on and so forth so they could be reformed, from that we're going to see that their numbers begin to grow over time. So much so that by the year 325 AD, 90% of the people of the Roman Empire, particularly in Rome, were Christians, identify themselves as Christians, that is to say. And only 10% continue to follow the old faith of the old Roman gods again. So what that meant is that 90% of the population does not consider the ruler, the Roman emperor, as legitimate. So, because the religion of the masses has changed, okay? And the ruler is validated from the Roman gods. The priests of the Roman religion are the ones that sanction, that provide the blessing, if you will, to the emperor. But only 10% see that as legitimate, because they still follow the Roman religion, whereas 90% see that as, totally useless, because all of those rituals, again, that they were performing for the emperor were completely meaningless, that is to say. So what that meant is that in order to continue the ruling institutions, the Roman emperors decided that it was time to convert to the religion of the masses, because otherwise they're not going to be seen as legitimate. So they need legitimacy, that is to say, they need to become legitimate in the eyes of the masses, and the masses are Christian. So therefore, you need to convert to Christianity again. So the emperor, the first Roman emperor that made that conversion was Constantine the Great. And Constantine the Great, again, was the Roman emperor who decided to abandon the old Roman religion and instead convert to Christianity. Okay? And so Constantine the Great then has to now abandon the old Roman gods and their Roman religion, if you will, and instead bring Christianity to the empire as the official religion of Rome and the official religion of the state, that is to say. So he needed to create a central church, a Christian church now, to represent the new faith. And he's the first Christian emperor, by the way. So again, this is when we see the rise in the year 325 of the Catholic Church. And the word Catholic means universal in Latin. Again, it was meant to be a universal church from the perspective of Constantine, in that it will convert virtually all of the people of the Roman Empire who were living in the provinces and the settlements and the faraway lands, again, that were part of the empire and perhaps of beyond, that they were to, again, be converted to this new religion, to this new faith, in other words, to live under the church, because the idea was, the established idea during this time was that the church, this new church, the Catholic Church, was Christian, was going to be the mediator between humans and God. Again, in other words, that this church is now the one that is in the middle between humans living on earth and God living in heaven. So in order for people to reach God, again, they need to do that through the church. In other words, I mean, one of the first principles, again, that was founded back during this time was the church is, again, the mediator, again, between the human and the divine, and in order for people to communicate, to have access to God, and also to have the aspiration to find salvation, to go to heaven after death, they need to be members of the church. So you need to be members and, go through the initiations of the church, like baptism, for example, confirmation. That is, again, reasserting your faith and reasserting your membership within the church. And so, therefore, you're a Christian, and with that, you're going to attain salvation. Again, marriage, and so on and so forth, married inside of the church, and so on, So after death, you also have to have the funeral, the Catholic funeral, and so on and so forth, so on. So again, there was now, again, this idea established that people require, again, a form of membership, if you will, and perform all the sacraments in order to be in good standing. Again, that was the idea. Now, the other thing, again, that was established was that Latin, which was the official language of Rome, this is the language that the Romans spoke, again, during the Roman era. Latin was going to be the language of the church, and all of the sacred texts are going to be translated into Latin, and Latin will be the official language of all of the religious services, like Mass, for example, and the instruction is going to be in Latin as well. And of course, the Bible itself was also translated in Latin from other languages. Again, there were books that were written from many other, regions of the Middle East, some of them in Greek, for example, Aramaic, and so on. And so we're going to see that the founders here of this new church are in the process of transcribing and translating those books into Latin. Of course, this is the sacred language, of course. As we'll see, some of the problems that this is going to create over time is that as the Romans are beginning to spread Christianity across Europe, a lot of people are not going to understand the language or the meanings or even the service itself. Because, again, when we're going to see, of course, Rome bringing Christianity to other peoples that had different linguistic backgrounds and so on, spoke different tongues or dialects and languages, in many cases they couldn't understand Mass at all, because Mass was delivered in Latin, so they just didn't understand what was really going on inside, or couldn't read the Bible, again, because the Bible was written in Latin, so they couldn't read it. So again, this is some of the issues that we're going to see, of course, being played out in the 15 and 1600s, as we'll see in some of the issues that is going to afflict Europe as people were trying to reform the church, by the way. Also, we're going to see that the church had a mission ever since it was founded by Constantine, and then, of course, future Roman rulers that presided over the church. The mission was that, as I mentioned a moment ago, that they needed to actually, the church itself was commissioned to convert all of the peoples of Europe. That is to say, to spread Christianity as far and wide as possible all across the continent in order to, again, transform people into this new Christian religion, the Christian faith. So, again, this is a process that is going to take centuries. Okay, centuries, by the way. There's missionaries, there's religious missionaries that are going to be sent in every direction, and they're going to go into other settlements, in other provinces, trying to learn the language of other peoples, and, trying to, impart the teachings, the doctrine, trying to convert them, build missions, build churches, and so on and so forth. So it's, it's a historical process that took a long, long time. So the significance of this is that what many of those missionaries realized is that in many cases the peoples that they were trying to convert did not really understand very well, okay, the message or the teachings of this new faith. So it was very hard to transform their beliefs, to abandon their old gods and goddesses that they worshipped, many of which were actually centered on natural forces like the moon and the sun, etc., and just implant a new belief system based on Christianity. And I mean, this is not going to happen overnight. So what they used instead is that they allowed those peoples that they converted to continue worshiping their gods and their goddesses, but with a new image. And that is that they introduced the image of saints and virgins into those peoples, saying that, well, you can continue worshiping the rain god or the thunder god or the moon goddess and so on and so forth, but I'm going to give you this image, which is now the image of that god. Because if you're praying to the thunder god, this is the saint that is in charge of that. Okay? Or if you're praying to the moon goddess, well, this is the virgin that is in charge of the moon. Whether you're talking about healing or reproduction, you're talking about abundance, or you're talking about fertility, things that the moon gives you, well, this virgin also gives you that. Okay, so you can continue your rituals, but you have to now honor the virgins and the saints. And so what ended up happening is that as Christianity expanded across Europe, we're going to see the creation of something called the cult of the saints, because this was a mechanism, a strategy of the church that was used in order to guarantee conversion. That people were not simply going to abandon their gods and goddesses overnight. What this had to happen in stages, and one of those stages had to be, the introduction of Catholic imagery, Christian imagery, the apostles, for example, like Mary or Jude, Saint Peter, and so on and so forth. That slowly but surely you're just replacing those beliefs, those gods and goddesses of the masses, if you will, the European continent, now with Christian imagery, if you will. So again, the significance of this is that, again, by the time of the 1500s and 1600s, when, again, the English settlers are arriving to North America, they rejected the cult of the saints, for reasons that we're going to actually look at, of course, in just a few moments, believing that what they were attempting to do was to simply go back as far back to the teachings of Christ as Christ actually imparted or instructed those teachings. So they considered the cult of the saints as something that came later after those teachings, and that was part of the strategy, if you will, to convert Europe to Christianity, but they just wanted to return to, again, the kind of the original teachings of Christ, what they call primitive Christianity, by the way. So again, this is again very important to understand how Europe is unfolding, and the religion in that Christianity actually started out as a spiritual religious movement indeed, but this religion and spiritual movement was also inspiring reform. Again, that the Christians were trying to reform Roman society, and they introduced, of course, Christianity into the Roman Empire. And by 325, it had become the religion of the masses. And with that, we see the creation of the church again, the Catholic Church, the first Christian church, by the way, in 325. And so we see the developments again of how the church is also, again, evolving, if you will, as to be the central church, Latin, for example, the official religion, the mediator between the divine and human beings, and so on, and the cult of the saints. Now, there's yet another very important development in church history, in the Christian church, that the reformers of the 15 and 1600s, many of whom are going to come to North America, by the way, to establish their colonies, they saw also as problematic, again, regarding, of course, of how the church had, in many cases, departed from the original, again, doctrine, again. So, and that is that in the year 850 AD, the church had become more concerned or more preoccupied with earthly endeavors, earthly endeavors, and that, again, it had become too much involved in the politics of Europe and with taxes. Okay, so again, from being a spiritual institution in charge of imparting the doctrine and so on, again, this is how the church started. Again, what the reformers are going to say much later in the 15 and 1600s, the religious reformers, is that the church by 850 had become too earth-based and too preoccupied with the affairs of this world, if you will, again. And that is because in 850, what we see is the formation of a new empire in Europe. The Roman Empire had fallen, by the way, in the year 450. That was the fall of the Roman Empire. It disintegrated, by the way. But the church continued existing. Nonetheless, the church continued, the Catholic Church, despite the fact that, again, there's no more Roman Empire and so on and so forth. The Roman Church continued the mission of spreading Christianity. But in the year 850, we're going to see the rise of another political structure, a political empire, in Europe, that in this time is going to be called the Holy Roman Empire. And the founder of that empire was the French monarch Charlemagne. Okay, so what Charlemagne wanted to do is unify all of the kingdoms of Europe under a single emperor, under a single ruler. Okay, the reason for that is very complex, but what happens is that there's, of course, conflict taking place between Christian Europe and, of course, the rise of Islam again in the Middle East. Again, there's a series of conflicts between European Catholics and Christians in this case, and the Muslims, of course. And there was the need to bring all of the rulers together, if you will, of Europe to defend the faith, to defend Christianity, to save Christianity, that is to say. So it was important to build an alliance, and in this case, a political alliance that will be centralized under the authority of one figure, an emperor. And in this case, it was a holy emperor. In other words, this is not just a political ruler. This is an emperor that is fighting for the faith. In other words, to save Christianity. It's holy, in other words. So there was an alliance between Charlemagne and the Church of Rome to come together, and both together are going to try to not only save Christianity, but expand the faith as well. So what that meant is that now every king or ruler or prince in Europe need to be Christian, and the mission of that king, ruler, or prince is to not only rule the realm, rule over the subjects, and manage the kingdom, the affairs of the kingdom, but also to try to fight for the faith. That they have the mission to save Christianity, in other words. So the implication of that is that the Church of Rome, in this case, the Pope, is going to now bless, if you will, the kings, the rulers, the princes of Europe, and that the Pope is going to become very much involved in the selection of those rulers. Whenever there will be a new ruler, for example, in a kingdom in Europe, well, the Pope is going to intervene to say, okay, so is this going to be a good Christian king? Is this person going to be in good terms with the church, and so on and so forth? And if that was the case, then the Pope will have to attend the ceremony of inauguration and place the crown over that individual. And that was a very symbolic act, meaning that what that act indicated is that now the authority of the rulers of Europe is now coming from the church, in other words. Okay, so the significance of this is that the church was now becoming more and more involved in the politics, again, of Europe, in selection of rulers, inaugurating them, and so on and so forth. And one of the functions of that, a marriage between what is called the Holy Roman Empire, this unification of the Christian kingdoms of Europe, if you will, led by the Holy Roman Emperor. It was Charlemagne first, and after Charlemagne there will be other Holy Roman Emperors, by the way. The significance of this is that the church from this marriage is also going to gain some material benefits in the form of taxes, in that rulers that were part of this Holy Roman Empire, or from this Christian empire, if you will, that had been formed, they will have to pay taxes to Rome. So every year, the rulers, the princes, the kings, the monarchs are paying taxes again to Rome. Again, so see that as significant, because this is yet another moment in which the critics, the reformers, if you will, much later in future centuries are going to see this as problematic, as to, well, this is now, an earthly institution as opposed to be just strictly speaking, a religious institution. Okay, so another, of course, aspect of church history that has to do also with taxes, by the way, is the church strategy to raise revenues through the so-called selling of indulgences. In other words, that besides collecting taxes from the different kingdoms of Europe, the church also resorted to yet another strategy to collect revenue. Okay, to collect revenue. And that is that another way to tax the population is by selling indulgences, or what became known during this time as tickets to heaven. tickets to heaven. So what is an indulgence? Well, an indulgence is really a receipt given by the church to an individual who has donated money to the church. Okay? Through that donation, when somebody donated money or maybe a piece of property, because some people might be dying, for example, at the moment of death, and at that moment they'll donate everything, their property, their home, etc., to the church, all sorts of donations. The church is going to give you a ticket in which the ticket indicated that now the church is going to oversee your salvation. Okay, is going to pray for you, is going to intercede with the divine in order to guarantee, in this case, an entrance in heaven after death. Okay, so that is the idea, the very general idea of the so-called ticket to heaven is that, well, if you donate money to the church gives you that ticket. Now, of course, it all started out as something like, well, if you donate money to the church, you're helping the Church of Christ, you're helping God's mission on earth to save souls. So this is not just, a practical matter in which people were simply donating monies, of course, to an institution, but rather that through that contribution, you are helping the mission of the church to save souls, that is to say. So it's not, again, that materialistic and that practical, that is to say. So it's considered to be an act of good work. It was called good works. Again, you have done something good that is going to help people, that is to say. That charity, that contribution, again, is really going to make a change in this world. That is to say, you're really doing something good. And so the belief back then was that those kinds of good works were very important in balancing out your bad actions, in other words. So in other words, the idea was that, okay, look, human beings are not perfect. We sin. We sin all the time, we behave very bad and so on in many occasions. And so we build, we build a sort of a burden, a negative burden of sin, if you will, but we can balance out that, those negative actions every time we perform a good action. So with good actions, some of those burdens, okay, that sin that will prevent us from entering heaven, that is to say, those good works can actually balance out the bad. Okay, that was the belief back then. And so people back then were very, very, very preoccupied with their souls, by the way. Okay, they were very concerned, very preoccupied about what was going to happen to my soul after death. Am I going to heaven? Or, as the doctrine indicated, there is also another place that you can go for those that did not follow the faith, did not practice the rituals, the sacraments, those that were not in good standing. Again, they're going to be lost after death. They're going to go to a place of torment, that is to say. They're going to suffer in the afterlife for eternity, by the way. Okay, so this is the Christian version of hell, that is to say. Something that Europeans were convinced that it was very, very real, and so they were very afraid of it. They suffer from a lot of anxiety. In other words, that look, I really don't want to go to this place. I want to avoid going to hell, so I really want to save my soul. And so here, people found an opportunity that there was an alternative. In other words, look, what we can do is do good works. Okay, and what kind of good works are they? Well, charity, money donations and so on. You go give the church, and the church will give you a ticket, if you will, a receipt, indicating how much you have donated. And that will indicate that the church was going to take care of your soul. They're going to pray for you, and so on and so forth, to guarantee that they're going to take away some of your sins and balance out, and so on, intercede with the divine, to make sure that you are not going to be damned, in other words, in the afterlife, and so on. You will not suffer, and so on and so forth. There was another aspect of this, so when somebody died and that person did not actually confess at the moment of death, did not release some of those burdens, the family was often very, very, very concerned with the destiny of that person's soul, of that family member. And they believed that in many cases, many of the souls that were neither totally bad nor totally good, they will go to a middle kind of world called purgatory. And there, they will have to purge some of their bad deeds before they will go to heaven. And so this is yet another idea that if you go to the church, you donate money, you pay for a mass or a series of masses, that through those masses, that the church was going to help those souls in purgatory actually purge their bad deeds so they could make their entrance into heaven as well. So what that meant is that people saw this as an outlet, as an opportunity to actually gain salvation through donations, through charity or good works. That's how it all started, by the way. But over time, this particular practice was taken to the extreme. Because over time, what people said is, well, you know what, I don't really need to discipline myself and be all that spiritual. Okay, I don't need to become a monk and renounce to the pleasures of the world and detach myself from all of the temptations and everything that the world has to offer me, etc., all the pleasures, because through good works, I can actually balance out my sins and actually go to heaven. Good works, meaning charity, meaning donations. So what people began doing in Europe over time is indulging in the pleasures of the world, indulging, again, pretty much giving license to their bodily appetites and their passions and vices, drinking and so on and so forth, behaving in whatever manner they wanted, because ultimately, even though you have sinned so much, you have fallen to temptations and pleasures, and you have indulged, all the bodily sensations and so on, all of that ultimately all you need to do is buy a ticket, in other words, and go to the church, make a donation, and the church is going to save you. In other words, they're going to actually intercede in your process of salvation. They're going to pray for you, they're going to do masses, and the higher you pay, the higher the donation, the more that they are going to work towards your salvation, that is to say. So people did not feel the need, therefore, to take personal responsibility, again, for their own salvation, in trying to correct their behavior, trying to balance their actions or anything like that. They just said, just indulge, in other words, pretty much indulge in everything you want to do. And again, there's no problem. You can balance out those bad acts with good works. So that's why it's called indulgences. Selling indulgences is, well, here it is. Here is an indulgence. In other words, if you pay or you donate monies to the church, the receipt that you're getting is really an indulgence, because people felt that through this ticket that I'm actually getting from the church, now I have license to indulge. I don't feel that burden anymore. My conscience is not going to feel that overwhelmed, because I know that somebody's taking care of me. There's the church, the institution, which is the mediator between the divine and human beings, is going to come and save me. Okay, my salvation is guaranteed, or at least the church is going to do everything as possible to save my soul, and so on and so forth. So this is very important, because this practice became so common and so pervasive the selling of indulgences in Europe, that by the 14 and 1500s, it was already a scandal in places like Italy, okay? The Italian peninsula, Rome itself, where the church was headquartered, and of course all across the peninsula, what we see, even in places like France, for example, is that we're going to see the rise of social decay in Europe. Again, society was in decay already by the 14 and 1500s. It was very visible. You can see with the rise of alcoholism. Again, it was becoming a social problem in Europe. Prostitution was becoming also a social problem, very rampant all across Europe. Poverty, violence, domestic violence, for example, was becoming, one of the most, common forms of social ills, because with alcoholism very often comes, of course, domestic violence, for example. So what we see is Europe in decay. By the 14 and 1500s, it was very visible. Perhaps not all over Europe, but there were places in which it was becoming very endemic, very visible. It was, again, an issue that many of the critics and reformers that we're going to be looking at, again, identify as the lack of spiritual, guidance. In other words, like why the situation has gotten to this point is because we lack an institution that can or could indeed guide people properly to follow the scriptures, to follow the instructions of Christ, to correct their behavior and so on, to modify their behavior, for people to actually renounce or give up many of those patterns of behavior that lead to vices, for example, in addiction and so on and so forth, because of the indulgences. That, again, there was an incentive for people to say, well, I don't need to stop all of this, again, all those pleasures, because there's always an outlet to actually balance out the bad with good works. So again, this is the situation. That is going to lead, of course, to the so-called Protestant Reformation of the 1500s. And this is the reform movement we're actually going to analyze in session 2. But this is the background to the Protestant Reformation itself. This is another reform movement. People in Europe wanted to reform Christianity. That's what the Protestant Reformation. People are going to protest. They're going to protest some of the practices, some of the teachings of the church, indicating that those practices, those teachings were not consistent, if you will, with the teachings of Christ originally given back during his life. And that because of that, what we see is, once again, Europe in decay, in moral and social decay, by the way. So in order to reform European society, it was important to reform Christianity. In other words, if we can only reform Christianity, we can reform the society once again. So again, the Protestant Reformation, something we're going to see, of course, in session 2, was precisely, again, a social reform movement that was attempted to bring back certain precepts, certain principles, certain ideas of Christianity that existed during the times of Christ, that they believed were going to be key, instrumental, of course, in transforming and saving European society as a whole. And again, this is a process that is going to unfold throughout the 15 and 1600s, and many of the English settlers that ended up coming to North America were part of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, they were, Protestants in many cases who believed that Europe could not be reformed. Many of them were actually giving up on Europe, again, trying to reform Europe, and instead they wanted to start Christianity in the New World, in North America, and initiate new Christian societies, ideal societies, if you will. Okay, so this is all I have for you. We have reached The end of our class today, session 1. When we come back in session 2, we're going to actually start from here, looking at the Protestant Reformation itself and how this is going to give rise again to Protestantism, Protestant denominations, all of the different branches of Protestantism that are going to be playing a key role in the founding of the colonies in North America, like the Puritans, for example. This is something that, again, we're going to examine in session 2. That's all I have for you, and we're going to actually, again, start with the Protestant Reformation in session 2. Good night.